The deportation apparatus of the United States has entered a new phase, one that demands we examine not just the immediate actions, but the structural forces that make such actions possible. What we're witnessing in our cities today isn't an aberration. It's the logical extension of decades of policy choices, economic pressures, and political calculations that have consistently prioritized enforcement mechanisms over human dignity. When federal immigration authorities conduct operations that disregard established legal protections, when they enter spaces traditionally considered sanctuaries under both domestic and international law, we must ask ourselves, what economic interests are served by this escalation? The answer lies in understanding how immigration enforcement has become intertwined with private detention contracts, labor market manipulation, and the political theater of border security. This isn't about safety or order. Those are the narratives we're given. This is about maintaining a permanent underclass of workers who can be threatened, displaced, and exploited without recourse. The constitutional questions raised by these operations, the Fourth Amendment violations, the disregard for due process, they aren't new. They're intensifications of existing contradictions within American capitalism, where the rights we claim to hold sacred become negotiable the moment they conflict with the demands of capital accumulation and political expediency. Let me be very clear about what we're dealing with here, because the language matters and the framing matters. When we talk about war crimes in the context of domestic immigration enforcement, we're invoking a specific legal framework that has consequences, and we need to understand why that language is being deployed and what it means for the broader trajectory of American governance. The Geneva Conventions, the international humanitarian law that governs conduct during armed conflict, these weren't designed to apply to police actions within a nation's borders. But here's where it gets complicated, and here's where we need to think carefully about what's actually happening. The reason people are reaching for this terminology, the reason we're hearing language that invokes international law and war crimes, is because what's taking place feels fundamentally different from ordinary law enforcement. It feels like occupation. It feels like the kind of military operation we've seen American forces conduct in foreign territories, where the distinction between combatant and civilian becomes blurred, where entire communities become suspect, where the rules that normally govern policing seem to have been suspended in favor of something more aggressive, more violent, more concerned with demonstrating power than with achieving any meaningful public safety objective. Think about what that means for a moment. We have a situation where federal agents are conducting raids in American cities with a level of force and disregard for procedural norms that would be recognizable to anyone who's studied counterinsurgency operations. They're entering homes without proper warrants, or with warrants so broadly written that they essentially authorize fishing expeditions. They're detaining American citizens, legal residents, and undocumented immigrants alike in sweeps that don't distinguish between someone with a criminal record and someone whose only violation is a civil immigration infraction. They're separating families, often without proper documentation of who was taken, where they're being held, or when they might see a judge. Now, from an economic standpoint, we have to ask ourselves what function this serves. And I don't mean the stated function, the rhetoric about public safety or national security or protecting American workers. I mean the actual structural function within our economic system. Immigration enforcement, particularly when it's conducted with this level of visibility and aggression, serves multiple purposes for capital. First, it creates fear within immigrant communities, both documented and undocumented. That fear is economically valuable because it makes workers more compliant, less likely to report labor violations, less likely to organize, less likely to demand better wages or working conditions. A terrified workforce is a controllable workforce, and a controllable workforce is a profitable workforce. Second, and this is crucial, these enforcement operations require enormous expenditure of public funds. We're talking about billions of dollars flowing to private detention companies, to contractors who provide transportation and logistics, to the manufacturers of surveillance technology, to the entire ecosystem of businesses that has grown up around the immigration enforcement apparatus. This is wealth extraction from the public treasury funneled directly to private profit. It's a form of corporate welfare disguised as law enforcement, and it follows the same pattern we see in military spending, in prison privatization, in every sector where the state claims to be providing security but is actually providing guaranteed profit streams to connected corporations. Third, there's the political economy of fear itself. When you create a spectacle of enforcement, when you conduct operations that are designed to be visible and terrifying, you're not just affecting the immediate targets. You're sending a message to the broader working class about what happens when you're deemed outside the bounds of acceptable society. This has a disciplining effect that extends far beyond immigrant communities. It reminds every worker that their rights are contingent, that their security is provisional, that the state possesses overwhelming force and isn't afraid to use it. This is social control through demonstration, and it's a tactic as old as state power itself. But let's go deeper into the constitutional crisis that's unfolding here, because this isn't just about immigration law. What we're witnessing is a fundamental challenge to the federal system, to the separation of powers, to the basic architecture of American governance as it's existed for more than 2 centuries. When federal agents conduct operations in cities whose elected officials have explicitly stated they will not cooperate with immigration enforcement, when they override local police departments and local policies, when they essentially occupy urban space without the consent of local government, we're seeing a reassertion of federal supremacy in a way that has profound implications. Now, some people will say this is perfectly legal, that federal immigration law supersedes local preferences, that cities don't have the right to obstruct federal enforcement. And technically, in certain narrow legal respects, that's true. But think about what this means in practice. Think about what it means when the federal government can send armed agents into any American city to conduct operations that local residents, local officials, and local law enforcement oppose. Think about the precedent that sets not just for immigration but for any area where federal and local priorities diverge. We're talking about environmental enforcement, labor law, civil rights protections, any domain where progressive cities have tried to offer more protection than federal law requires. The Supreme Court has consistently held that the federal government cannot commandeer state and local officials to enforce federal law. That's the anti-commandeering doctrine, and it's based on principles of federalism that both conservatives and progressives have historically supported, albeit for different reasons. But what we're seeing now is the flip side of that doctrine being tested. If the federal government can't force local officials to help with immigration enforcement, can it simply deploy its own forces in overwhelming numbers to accomplish the same goal? Can it turn cities into zones of federal occupation where local governance becomes irrelevant? These are not theoretical questions. This is happening right now, and the answers we arrive at will shape American governance for generations. Because once you establish that the federal government can override local opposition through sheer force, once you normalize the presence of federal agents conducting military-style operations in American cities, you've fundamentally altered the balance of power in our federal system. And that alteration benefits certain interests and harms others in very predictable ways. Let's talk about who benefits. The executive branch benefits by demonstrating its power, by showing that it can impose its will regardless of local resistance. The private detention industry benefits enormously, as we've discussed. The political constituency that supports aggressive immigration enforcement benefits by seeing their preferences enacted, which gives them a sense of political efficacy and keeps them mobilized. And the broader project of neoliberal capitalism benefits because the spectacle of enforcement distracts from questions of economic redistribution, labor rights, and the fundamental inequalities that structure our society. Who loses? Obviously, immigrant communities lose in the most direct and devastating ways. But the losses extend much further. Local democracy loses when elected. Local officials cannot govern their own cities according to the preferences of their constituents. Constitutional protections lose when the Fourth Amendment becomes essentially optional during immigration operations. The rule of law loses when enforcement becomes so aggressive and so unmoored from proportionality that it feels arbitrary and tyrannical. And the American working class as a whole loses because the divisions being sown, the fear being generated, the militarization of domestic space, all of this makes collective organizing and collective resistance more difficult. Now, I want to address the question of legality versus legitimacy, because this distinction is absolutely crucial. Something can be technically legal according to current statutes and court interpretations while still being fundamentally illegitimate, fundamentally wrong, fundamentally incompatible with the values a society claims to hold. We've seen this throughout American history. Slavery was legal. Segregation was legal. The internment of Japanese Americans was legal. The fact that courts and legislatures sanctioned these practices didn't make them right, and it didn't prevent future generations from recognizing them as profound moral failures. What we're witnessing now with immigration enforcement may be operating within certain legal parameters, though even that's contested, but we need to ask whether it's legitimate. Does it reflect the kind of society we want to be? Does it align with constitutional principles of human dignity and due process? Does it serve the public good, or does it serve narrow political and economic interests? These are the questions that matter, and these are the questions that the legal framework alone cannot answer. The international community has developed standards for how states should treat people within their territory, regardless of immigration status. These standards recognize that certain rights are inherent to human beings, not contingent on citizenship or legal status. The right to be free from arbitrary detention, the right to due process, the right to family unity, the right to be free from cruel and degrading treatment. These aren't privileges that states can grant or withhold at will. They're recognized as fundamental by international law, by human rights treaties that the United States has signed, by the basic moral frameworks that undergird modern democracy. When immigration enforcement violates these principles, when it treats human beings as enemies to be neutralized rather than as people with rights that must be respected, even during enforcement actions, we've crossed a line. Maybe it's not technically a war crime in the legal sense because the specific context doesn't meet the Geneva Convention definitions. But it's a moral crime, a democratic crime, a violation of the basic compact between a government and all people within its jurisdiction. And that matters. That has consequences. That shapes what kind of country we become. Let's also consider the economic irrationality of what's happening, because even if you set aside all moral considerations, even if you approach this purely from a cost-benefit analysis, the current approach makes no sense. We're spending billions of dollars to disrupt communities, to break up families, to remove workers from productive employment, to create chaos and fear. What do we get for that expenditure? Do we get enhanced public safety? The data doesn't support that. Do we get economic benefits? On the contrary, we lose economic productivity. We lose tax revenue. We lose the contributions that immigrants make to our communities. Do we get a more secure border? The evidence suggests that aggressive interior enforcement actually incentivizes people to stay, rather than circulating back and forth, because crossing becomes more dangerous and more final. So if it's not achieving its stated objectives, if it's actually counterproductive by most measures, why does it continue? And why does it escalate? The answer is that the stated objectives aren't the real objectives. The real objectives are political theater, wealth extraction through government contracts, labor control through fear, and the maintenance of a racialized hierarchy that divides the working class against itself. Those objectives are being achieved quite successfully, even as the official justifications ring increasingly hollow. This is why we need to understand immigration enforcement as part of a broader system of social control, not as an isolated policy area. It connects to mass incarceration, to police militarization, to surveillance expansion, to the erosion of civil liberties in the name of security. These are all pieces of the same project, which is the construction of an increasingly authoritarian state apparatus that can suppress dissent, control labor, and protect capital accumulation even as inequality widens and social conditions deteriorate. Immigration enforcement is a testing ground for tactics and legal theories that will eventually be applied more broadly. The normalization of federal occupation of cities, the acceptance of mass detention without trial, the creation of a category of people who have essentially no rights, all of this sets precedents that will come back to haunt us in ways we may not anticipate. And we need to be honest about the racial dimension of all this, because it's not incidental. Immigration enforcement in the United States has always been racialized, has always been used as a tool to maintain white supremacy and to control populations deemed threatening or undesirable, The current escalation is happening in a political context where explicitly white nationalist rhetoric has become mainstream, where the dehumanization of immigrants, particularly Latino immigrants, is a central part of political discourse. When we see immigration enforcement that disregards constitutional protections, that treats entire communities as suspect, that uses overwhelming force without proportionality, we're seeing the practical application of that dehumanizing rhetoric. This is what happens when a society decides that certain people don't count, that their rights don't matter, that they can be subjected to violence in the name of order. It's not new in American history, but it's always shameful, and it's always a warning sign of democratic decay.